Just as the figure reached out for him, Michael snapped awake, his body jerking violently. His heart pounded in his chest, and sweat coated his brow. He was back in the cabin, gasping for breath. The room was still, the fog was gone, and there was no sign of the man. He stood shakily, his legs weak beneath him, trying to steady his breathing. Was it a vision? A hallucination? Or had the bayou itself come alive, pulling him into its twisted grip? But there was no time to dwell on it. He had to break the curse. His father's journal had said it was up to him, and though he didn't understand how, Michael knew that this was his fight now. The bayou would not claim him. With renewed determination, Michael gathered his strength. It was time to face whatever darkness lay ahead. The night felt different. The oppressive weight of the bayou had settled into Michael's chest, and every step he took felt heavier than the last. He'd spent hours in the cabin, searching for clues, reading and rereading his father's journal, trying to make sense of the cryptic messages hidden within the old pages. Nothing seemed to provide the answers he so desperately needed. But there was one thing that stood out, a final passage, one written in a hurried, almost frantic script. It had been the last thing his father had written before his disappearance. Do not go into the heart of the bayou. The thing that waits there is not meant for us. It will take what it wants, and you will never return. It was clear his father had known the danger. Had known the price of the curse, and now Michael was bound to it, whether he liked it or not. But Michael had no choice. His family was cursed, and the only way to break it was to confront the entity that had been haunting them for generations. The figure in the fog, the eerie whispers in the trees, they were all a part of it. He had to face it. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the bayou as Michael made his way deeper into the woods. Every step felt like it took him farther from reality. The trees closed in, their branches curling like skeletal fingers, blocking out the moonlight. The air had grown thick with an unnatural heaviness, and the sounds of the bayou, once so familiar, now felt like an ominous warning. As he ventured farther, Michael could feel it. The bayou itself was alive, alive with something ancient, something evil. The very earth beneath his feet seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, and the trees whispered in a language he couldn't understand. He tried to block it out, to stay focused, but the closer he got to the center of the bayou, the more the air seemed to shimmer with malice. Suddenly, there was movement ahead. A figure emerged from the shadows, walking slowly toward him. At first, Michael thought it was just another trick of the light, but as the figure drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was the same man from his vision. The pale, hollow-eyed figure that had haunted his dreams. He was tall, his clothes torn and ragged, and his face, it was as though it had been stretched too thin, pulled tight over an unnatural frame. His eyes, black as night, fixed on Michael, and for a moment, Michael felt himself paralyzed, rooted to the spot. "You've come at last," the man said, his voice low and filled with a chilling anticipation. "It's been so long. You don't know what you're walking into, do you?" Michael swallowed hard. "Who are you?" he demanded, though his voice trembled. "What do you want?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was a cruel, hollow thing. "I was once like you, you know. A fool, thinking I could escape. That's what your great-grandfather thought, too. And look where it got him." Michael's heart sank. This was the man his father had written about, the one who had made the cursed pact. He was the one responsible for this nightmare, for the darkness that had twisted his family's fate. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," the figure continued, taking another slow step toward him. "The curse is more than just a story. It's real. It consumes everything. Your bloodline, your soul. And now it's your turn." Michael clenched his fists, fighting against the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "I'm not like you," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I won't let it take me." The figure's expression twisted into something darker. "You don't have a choice. It's already inside you. The blood of your ancestors runs through your veins. The curse is already binding you to it. Michael felt the cold grip of dread closing in around him. The bayou seemed to grow darker still, the trees bending toward him like hungry beasts. The ground beneath his feet trembled as though something below was awakening. The figure raised a hand, and Michael instinctively stepped back. You think you can just walk away? You think you can break the curse with your blood and your courage? Fool. But as the figure's words sank in, Michael's fear began to give way to something else. He couldn't back down. Not now. The bayou was his legacy, his burden, and it was up to him to end it. There was no escape. He remembered his father's journal, the warnings that had been written there. There was only one way to defeat the curse, only one way to sever the bond that had tied his family to the bayou's dark forces. With a deep breath, Michael squared his shoulders and stepped forward. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to let this entity take him. You may have been the first, Michael said, his voice steady and defiant, but I will be the last. The figure's lips curled into a sinister smile. You think you're different? You think you can change your fate? No one escapes the bayou. But Michael wasn't listening anymore. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last thing his father had left him, a small, tarnished pendant. It had been worn by his great-grandfather, a symbol of the pact that had been made. The pendant glowed faintly in the moonlight, a soft blue light emanating from it as though it was alive. The figure recoiled, his expression twisted with rage. No. You don't understand what you're doing. You're going to destroy us all. But it was too late. The pendant was the key. Michael held it up, and the air around him seemed to crackle with energy. The trees shook, the ground quaked, and a horrible, shrill sound filled the air, a sound like 1,000 voices crying out in agony. The figure shrieked, its form beginning to dissolve into the mist. No. You can't. But Michael held his ground. With one final, resolute gesture, he snapped the pendant in half. A burst of light erupted from the pendant, blinding him, and for a moment, everything went silent. The light from the pendant enveloped Michael, bright and blinding, until he could no longer see the shadowy figure or the bayou around him. For a long, disorienting moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the light began to fade, leaving behind an eerie calm. When Michael opened his eyes, the bayou was still. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, the strange tension that had once hung over the land now gone. The twisted trees no longer seemed to loom menacingly, and the whispering voices had fallen silent. It was as though the very soul of the bayou had been freed, the curse finally broken. But there was no sign of the man, the one who had haunted him. The figure that had once threatened to consume him, to drag him into the darkness, had vanished. Michael couldn't shake the sense that something had been banished, not just from the land, but from his own bloodline. It took him a few moments to collect himself, to fully grasp what had just happened. He had done it. He had severed the curse. The thing that had haunted his family for generations, the malevolent entity that had fed on their fears and blood, was no more. Exhaustion crashed over him in waves. He dropped to his knees, finally allowing himself a moment of relief. His chest heaved with each breath, and for the first time in a long while, his mind was free of the relentless terror that had clouded it. The weight of the past had been lifted, and the future, his future, was his own. As the moonlight bathed the bayou, Michael felt something new, a sense of peace, of closure. He could hear the sounds of the bayou once again, but now they were different. The frogs croaked, the insects hummed, and the wind rustled through the trees in a way that felt normal. Safe. He stood, still trembling, but resolute. The bayou no longer had a hold on him. He was no longer trapped in the cycle of fear that had bound his family. The curse had been broken. After a long pause, Michael glanced down at the broken pendant in his hand. It was no longer glowing. The power it had once held was spent, and with it, the legacy of the curse. He felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not just for the escape, but for the strength it had taken to face the terror and confront the past head-on. His father, his grandfather, and every other soul who had tried to break the curse before him were now free. As he turned to leave, he noticed a faint flicker in the distance, just at the edge of the bayou, where the trees met the horizon. A soft glow, like a lantern. Michael wasn't sure if it was a trick of the light or if it was something more, but in that moment, he didn't feel afraid. Whatever it was, it didn't matter anymore. He walked out of the bayou, every step feeling lighter than the last. The road ahead was unclear, but for the first time, it was his to walk. And as he made his way back to the cabin, the distant hum of the bayou seemed to whisper a final farewell, as though acknowledging that the curse had finally been broken. When Michael returned to the cabin, it felt different. The air was still heavy with the history of his family, but now, it was no longer burdened by the weight of the curse. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. There would be no more shadows in his life, no more dark figures waiting at the edge of his vision. He knew that he had a long road ahead of him, rebuilding the legacy of his family and finding a way to move forward. But for now, he was content with the peace that had come from breaking the curse. The bayou would no longer haunt his dreams. As he walked toward the door, ready to leave the cabin behind, he glanced back one last time at the dark, quiet water. The wind stirred the trees once more, and the faintest hint of dawn lightened the sky. The curse was broken. And Michael had finally earned his freedom. Thank you for joining us in this chilling tale of family curses and the fight for freedom. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling adventures. And while you're here, check out the videos on your screen for even more spine-tingling stories. Stay tuned for our next haunting experience.